Thank you very much for the invitation, although I think it's rather a challenge to be in the company of so many experts in public communication and not being an expert myself. On the other hand, that's the usual way for futurists. We are always amateurs in the company of people who know their business better than we do, and I certainly hope that's the case today too, because otherwise you've got big problems. So let me start by talking about something I know about. I come from, as it was said, from something called the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, a very un-Scandinavian thing because it's a privately funded research institute created by a fascinating man called Torkel Christensen, who used to be Secretary General of the OECD. And you have Torkel in the picture here, and it's Torkel on the right if you should be in doubt. He started this when he came back from the OECD in 1970. The most awful fact I have to admit is that I have been at the Institute since 1976. It's rather embarrassing to have to admit that you haven't had the imagination, energy to find alternative jobs for so many years. But you can see it in books, so you might as well admit it freely, but it's nothing to brag about. What we are doing at the Institute, and what I'm going to give examples of, studying the future, is also very problematical. I mean, you can't really study something that doesn't exist, and that is the essential thing about the future. So therefore I always try to be more honest than soothsayers and the like by starting to say that of course you can't predict, and especially not the future. Basically because we all know that the future is something we create as we go along. So we can't predict. On the other hand, we can't help it, because of the sad but true fact that decisions have to be made in the present, which is quite irritating. I mean, it wouldn't be lovely if we could make some decisions in the past. Huh? I don't know about you guys, but I have various things I'd like to get fixed if that was possible. I imagine that lots of people within the financial sector are dreaming of making some decisions in the past, just guessing. But you can't. You're always stuck in this lousy present when you have to make your decisions, and they have to work in that future which is so badly documented. Therefore, we all go around having lots of expectations of the future, because without expectation of the future, we are unable to make any kind of decision. Now, most of these expectations are subconscious, so there's a good reason to work with the future, namely to become conscious of what you expect, because then at least you can see when you're wrong, which is the only thing I'm going to guarantee 100%. We will all eventually be wrong, but if you can see it, you'll get a message and maybe a chance to do something about it. So I guess it's better than nothing. And now we are talking on future studies. Maybe I should turn even a bit more philosophical and say it's a matter of our concept of time. And I expect that you have a rather primitive concept of time, because the usual way of thinking in time is that there was a past who created the present, and here in the present we go around creating the future. I'm sorry, it's absolutely too primitive. And I have to stress that we are always in the present. Some people act as if they are in the past, but it's not true. And we know that we are a product of the past, but sometimes we should remember that we are standing in the present and guessing at how it used to be. And we have some professionals who do that. They call themselves historians. And on the other hand, we are living in the present and creating the future, but always in the light of what we expect this future should be. So we are always living in the present, but a more mentally expanded present, where we go back and forth between our ideas of the past and our expectations of the future in order to make decisions in the present. This is a never-ending process. And should you sometimes think that the future looks slightly threatening, relax and remember it's always a matter of time before the threatening future turns into the good old days. It seems to be a mechanism that changes threats into nostalgia. William Gibson has once said that the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. I think it's a very, very fascinating sentence, because it points to the fact that we are not all entering the future concurrently. What's the future for some is the present for others and the past for third party. And there's nowhere where it's so evident than when you're looking at digitalization. You see at people's relation to digital products, which is quite important, we're talking about public communication, there are three types. There are the digital natives, those young people who have grown up with it and have a sort of organic relationship to it. There are the digital immigrants, people like me who frantically try to keep abreast. And then there are the digital idiots, and they'll soon die. But when are they dead enough? That is a big challenge, because you cannot get the full productivity gain as long as you have a digital and an analog system parallel, which you will have as long as you have to take care of the digital idiots. So when are they dead enough? That's the problem, especially when you're talking about public communication, which cannot be so commercial as a company who says, now the digital customers are idiotic digital customers are so few, so we can ignore them. It's not quite the same way within public communication. There are two classes of forecasters, those who don't know and those who don't know they don't know. Pretty nasty. So I like to end on, I'll land on the quote by Louis Pasteur, which says, "The chance favors the prepared mind." The idea of talking the future is not to be right in the future. Of course, it's nice, but it's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is your work with the future inspires you in a way that makes you able to see the potential things in the present, because we will never leave the present. We are always stuck at the present. Or you could say it with Gaston Berger, that the purpose of looking at the future is to disturb the present. Now, when we look at public communication, I got thinking on traveling down here to Brussels. Well, and the German part of my mind took over and said, we've got to have a definition. Eine Definition ist absolut notwendig. And I thought, how do you define public communication? And the more I thought of it, the more I thought it's hopeless, especially in the light of WikiLeaks and Mr. Snowden. Every communication seems to be public. I mean, there's no end of public communication, right? So I dropped it to let the British side of my brain take over and say, who cares how to define it? We know it. It's a bit like another concept which is difficult to define, pornography, where an American judge once said, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And it's a bit the same with public communication. Now, thinking of how I could contribute to the future of public communication, I thought, why don't we take various trends within commercial communication and see how could public communication be inspired by them. Of course, companies, they have a bottom line. Even when they're talking about corporate social responsibility, it's still a bottom line they're talking about. But public communications, they also have a bottom line. It's achieving a change in awareness and interest and attitudes and that kind of thing. So maybe we could get something out of the commercial trends. And the first I'd like to stress is that we are still and slowly and surely moving from push to pull. People do not want to be pushed. People do not want to be overwhelmed with data. People think people are increasingly anti-authoritarian. I know my Danes, but I think lots of other Europeans have the same tendency. Nobody should decide what I ought to know. People are individualistic. They think they're unique. It's usually not the case, but if they think they're unique, you have to act as if you think it's true, because otherwise they're getting rather angry. And if you keep on pushing, they will get better and better at evading your push. They will get better and better in establishing barriers and filters and whatever. So you have, in public communication, you have to make systems that sort of tempts people to pull the data, nudge them in ways, not sort of say, you ought to know this. So that, I think, is the first and very important from push to pull. Secondly, you meet them where they are. I know you're already working with it. I heard an interesting workshop before coming here. You have to go out there where they are and meet them there. They are increasing at the social media. Now, I'm an old man, and I sometimes have difficulty in sorting all these various social media. So let me help you. I have this overview where you can find out which kind of social media you're talking about. You have Twitter, I need to pee. You have Facebook, I did it. Foursquare is more geographical, so this is where I did it. Quora is more sort of philosophical. Why do IP? Then you have YouTube, look at it, and then in the end, LinkedIn, you brag, I'm damn good at being. I mean, it helps you understand these various social media. But we all know that the reality is much more complicated. This is sort of more the real picture of the social media. And I think one of the challenges for public communications is to be able to follow which are the waning media and which are the coming media. I mean, which is going to be the next Facebook? I've heard that in various countries, Facebook has climaxed and losing members. So what's the name? What's the next one going to be? Does anybody remember Second Life? It was all the rage some years ago. I don't know whether it exists anymore. So this is not a fixed picture. It's going to sort of change over all the time. So far, then we come to the more Dr. Strangelove type. Now, in commercial circles, they're working with something called My Profile, which is based on companies being better and better able to register what people are buying, and they are better and better to follow how people rate their product. And by this, they are enabled to create more and more sophisticated customer relation management, where they are able to send messages which are totally individualized because they know precisely what each customer wants, send them recommendations, offers, based on psychographic criteria. Why shouldn't public communicators do the same? So huge number of data, so it could use it to send these individualized messages and thereby engaging each one much better, because the message would be implicitly interesting because they know what each citizen wants. So you could end up having this, you know more about them. In the good old days, we say, we know where you live. With geographical things, today we can say, we know where you are. Sounds slightly threatening, could be too. So we have this. And the next trend I would point to is gamification. It's, people do not want to be bored. I know it's strange, but that's the fact. They hate to be bored. And using games in communication is absolutely good because they get a reward by gaming, making the results. It touches the nucleus accumbens up in the brain, which makes you gratified because it's fun, makes status and that kind of thing. You all know that gamification is the most potent weapon in learning. Because the most potent weapon in learning is called instant feedback. The good old school, there you did your paper and next week you got a report on how good it was. In games, you get instant feedback, so you learn much quicker. Look at the young people and all these games they play. Do they look in the manual? No, they wouldn't dream of it. They sort of find out, they sort of realize how to do it, and because it's fun. So what you can do there, you can encourage concrete actions from the citizen. You can make it easier to do necessary, but for the citizen, complicated changes. And you can retain the interest of the citizen in a cheaper way. Because this is community building. If you make it like games, if you have EU games that people play, maybe you have an EU community. There was a game some years ago where people could play at solving the most important problems in the world. Why not start by solving the most important problems in the EU? I think there's enough to take up. I mean, no lack of tasks there. So in the end, I think the communication should realize that we usually do it the wrong way. We start with some technology and say, what can we use it for? We make a product, and then we see what solves it. And only in the end, we realize what was the meaning. Maybe you should reverse it and say, what kind of meaning are we talking? And then work backwards and find the right technology. And finally, and that's maybe slightly more peripheral, touch pips. You know, probably all have the mobile phone, and this has this ability that we can your phone and my phone can talk together.
No, my phone.
You have no?
Never, no.
You ought to. Yes. Sorry, that was. So you can get information over. You can pay and you can share music or documents. It's called near-field communication. And the great thing about this is you could maybe also in the future use touch to vote. Yeah, just an idea. Because the good thing is that these near-field communications, they're so close, so you can't hack. There's no ability to hack into that kind of thing. So it makes it much more safe. And you can increasingly have all in your phone, all these cards, paying cards and you can use it to get information out of the EU, for instance. And in the end, you can integrate all your transactions, information, money, on the mobile phone. And then someone will say, yeah, well, what happens if you lose your phone? Yeah, well, no problem. It's all up in the cloud. So you get a new phone and get all the things into the phone again. So no problem. So, so what I've been trying to say is, first of all, that maybe public communication and communication in general aren't all that different. Maybe they are going to look more and more like each other. Secondly, we are increasingly working from the good old Puritanism to hedonism. When I studied many, many, many years ago, it was still an established fact that the more boring a book was, the more clever you got if you understood it. Yeah. That was we had a special book in some law. It was so incredibly boring you can't imagine, and there you got a point for each time you read it through. Yes, up to 11. Then after that you had to be a genius. Yeah, it doesn't work that way anymore. People do not want to be bored. They want to have fun. So how do you make EU exciting and fun? I mean, that is a big challenge for public communicators. I think that's what you should be doing. Now, you may think that some of these things are nasty. I am not totally in love with all of them either. But if you don't like them, then you remember the future is something which we produce as we go along. So if you don't like it, make sure it doesn't happen. But if you want to make sure it doesn't happen, then you have to make up something else instead. Because something is going to come also in public communication. With this, I will stop up and say thank you for your attention. Stay curious. There's lots more into the future. Thank you very much.